success, wealth, recognition. Gary Cooper had it all, lost it all, then turned a revolutionary discovery into the success paradox. Here's Gary.
Thanks for joining me once again for my conversation with Patrick Doyle and Amber Lyn from Pathway to Hope. We've been talking about the online community they built that empowers women experiencing emotional abuse. Now, Patrick and Amber, in part one, we talked about the trauma that could affect someone's personal life. But since this is a Forbes Book podcast, I'd like to shift things over to the business side of life. Because I've seen it during their 9 to 5. I've seen people who have suffered at home, and then they're suffering at work with a coworker or boss. Patrick, how have you helped those folks?
Well, oddly enough, Gary, I do have done a fair amount of business consulting. And the reason why is I used to have a radio and TV show for years in my local area. And so, people gained trust in me. And then those business leaders would come to me under confidence because they're out of control and they don't know what to do and they need help. And so one of the things that you just said, you're talking about, somebody comes to work and their behavior is problematic. And I would take it outside of male and female and I would put it squarely on looking at the wounds. So I could talk to somebody in a business setting and I know within 5 minutes where the wound is, generally, okay, based on their pathological response. When I say pathology, I mean, if I go to the doctor and he takes my blood sugar and it's 800, what we have is evidence of the pathology of diabetes in my body. And what we know about that is diabetes is going to follow the same path every time. It's pathological until it's interrupted, right? So people have spiritual and emotional pathology. So someone who's doing self-harm on a regular basis and denying it, I know that they have a shame frame. Because if you don't value yourself, that's the only way it makes sense to harm yourself.
The flip side of this is really successful people, and there's been studies, and I'm sure you've read them, CEOs and really successful people have a pathological, a lot of them have narcissism. Some of them have been compared to serial murderers. So it is rewarded to be a bull in a china shop in business a lot of times. I don't particularly reward that kind of behavior. So if you have a person who is quiet or shy or whatever, they can tend to get run over. So we have people that are listening to this. There's two sides to this equation. We've been run over, and then there are people who run over people. I have been both. And so I have been the guy who wouldn't shut up in meetings. I have been the guy who talked over people. I have been the guy who left people out of meetings. I have been the guy who was just a jerk. And then I've been the guy who was so sensitive, I got my little paper tissue feelings hurt when I got left out of meetings. The same guy. So I guess my question is, there's a lot of work to be done in the business setting for people with the same issues that Amber Lyn was talking about, because that same characteristic of gaslighting happens in the business world.
Oh, yeah. It's in the political world. It's in the business world. It's in the church world. It's everywhere.
Do you have any advice on how to deal with a coworker who gaslights you, who triggers your fight or flight, your shame, all that stuff?
Well, first, before we get into that, Gary, I just wanted to note the difference between you and one of these narcissistic behaviors is you actually see that you were doing that and you were wanting to do something different. Like, they don't see that at all, and they avoid responsibility at all costs. I just wanted to note, like, the distinction in that is like, yes, Patrick has done that. Yes, I've done my fair share of hurting people too, but it's not who we are. It's not what we want to do. And the fact that we're willing to look at ourselves and just recognize that is part of your beauty, my beauty, and his beauty.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that brings me to a good segue, maybe. My daughter's bipolar. And when she was diagnosed, my wife made an interesting observation. They said, your daughter is bipolar. They didn't say she has cancer. So when we diagnose people with mental illnesses, and we've all experienced us three both have experienced some type of mental issues. But they labeled her, she is bipolar, not she has a bipolar condition. I think, Amber Lyn, what happened to me was one of the worst things that ever happened in my life. And that's the same thing that happened to you and Patrick. Us three have chosen to turn that into the best thing that's ever happened in our lives. How have you helped people turn their worst liability into their best asset?
By confronting their denial. If you aren't willing to deal with the truth of your situation as it really is, not as you hope it is, not as you think it is, not as you've been told it is, as it really is for you, then you're not going to be able to overcome it and then use it as an asset. Denial is the thing that will kill your relationships, destroy your self-worth, and make you miserable. That's the fulcrum. So having the courage, and then also, I strongly believe this, no one is going to change without some perceived level of safety. I need to know that somebody is going to take care of me or going to be in my corner before I open Pandora's box in my soul. And again, I strongly believe in this, in the context of a situation. Like your daughter has a context. There are layers, the things that have led to her reacting in a certain way that could be labeled bipolar, but there's very real pain and issues in her heart that can be addressed that would alleviate the symptomology.
And they have.
Yeah. So, but again, I believe when you label someone, you cease to love them. It's a bad idea. So I would say confront the denial in a supportive, safe environment. And that process, I believe, is why you're where you're at, Gary, is because you did confront the denial and you made different decisions. But without that, you keep going, you double down.
So how long did it take you? You've had a hard journey. So what was the hardest part of your journey? Was it getting to that point?
I really believe in, the layers. Like there were so many layers. It took time for me to have the strength to get to one layer after another, right? So I'd never say it was one instance, but what I will tell you that led me to the greatest level of healing is deeply, intimately trusting another person and telling them the thing that I was afraid to tell anyone. And rather than doing what my father would have done, them caring for me and being present with me, that vulnerability and then being cared for was the thing that gave me transformation in terms of my own internal value.
I called the book Success Paradox for a reason, and I never thought vulnerability was a strength. And I now know it's a superpower. I came in one night to my house, and I did the typical thing that men do. I got quiet. I wasn't talking in front of my wife, and I made her immediately scared. And then she was like, is he a cheater? Is he a liar? I mean, what happened? What did he do? Finally, I said, I'm really scared about money. And she was like, that's nothing. Why didn't you just tell me that? And I said, because I don't feel like a man. I feel less than a man when I tell you that I'm worried about money. And I started crying. I'm like, I don't know why I feel like a man. And she was like, you're such an idiot. We can work around that. And so that vulnerability, we ended up laughing about it.
Yeah. But listen, Gary, you don't know till you know, right? Prior to that moment, you were completely convinced it was a bad idea and that it was something terrible was going to happen. And, we could dive into the etymology of why you believe that, but I don't think that's nearly as important as recognizing the fact that you did. I mean, look, it may have been courage, it may have been desperation. We don't care. You did it.
We had a young man in our group tell us how he was sexually molested, and it was 12 men. And he was so ashamed and embarrassed. And we all just went and gave him a hug and were telling him how proud of him we were. He started crying. He's like, I thought you guys would think I was, label him as gay and all this stuff. And we're like, dude, it happened. He was like, that's not the response I was expecting.
That's the beauty of what exactly I'm talking about. That right there. That was revolutionary, and that man's life will never be the same.
He's happy and sober today.
Yeah, exactly.
Amber Lyn, how about you? What's the hardest part of your journey?
Well, I would say it's still the shitty committee. Although it's not as loud as it used to be, it still comes up. And, I wish I could tie a big red bow at the end of the story, but, that's partly why I can relate so well to my clients and stuff. Is like, and I empathize. I understand the second guessing yourself still. So I would say just being in my head. One of the things that really helped me though was, with every committee, there's a chairman. And being able to identify who that chairman was for the longest time with the shitty committee really helped me. And that was my mom. So her voice is what I hear a lot. It's not as loud as it used to because I done fired her a long time ago. And so I sit in that chairman chair. But my joke is like every once in a while she'll peek her head through the window. Then I'll like, security, like get her out. But she still comes around every once in a while. When you're talking like over half my life of her in my head, I'm going only 7 years with no contact, and I'm 37 now. So it's like she's in my head still. But it's not as strong and powerful because I'm sitting in that spot now.
That's great advice. I don't know about y'all, but I told somebody recently that the itty bitty shitty committee comes alive about 2:00 in the morning for me. And so I have some stuff that I read beside my bed. It's spiritual in nature, and there's some prayers. I call them my board of directors also. I have found that God, or I don't care what people call God, I don't care what it is. Mine was my father. For me, it was guilt, not ever being good enough. And no matter what I accomplished, wasn't enough. And now I can say, you're good enough just the way God made you.
And what you're describing, Gary, I think if I had a way to help people increase their internal value of themselves, I could solve a lot of problems and make this world a lot better place for a lot of people. But what you described is the fulcrum. Having validation, I go to the things at my nightstand that validate my value, that I believe, that are meaningful. For me, what I did was I wrote a book of remembrance. I went back through my life and wrote down every time I felt cared about and who did it. Had an experience that valued me, because the committee doesn't listen to propaganda. They only listen to what I actually believe.
You're so right. What I believe is I had to make investments in myself. We were talking about who validates me. I went to someone like yourself. I went to a 12-step program. I went to a preacher that I trusted, not one that I was going to before. I eliminated people in my life, increased other people in my life. I learned to say no. This old, beautiful black man, we called him Big E. He said, boy, you got to practice this way of life until it becomes a way of life. Do you have any comments or recommendations, Patrick or Amber Lyn, on how people can practice it?
I mean, I just want to like look at the camera and just say that you have value and you have worth. And I'm so sorry for those people in your life that told you that you don't. I hope that you start believing more in yourself, because the world also needs you. Though you don't see your gifts and your talents, they're there. And once you start believing this about yourself, you're going to start learning more and more, and you're going to inspire others too.
Patrick, how about you, Patrick? How can you change a narrative?
Well, you can't change a narrative till you identify it. So you got to know what the negative narrative is so you can modify it to the right one. And so that's why I really encourage people to jot down what they're hearing. And then like you, Gary, talk to someone who can give them honest feedback about the reality of that. If it stays in your head, it maintains power.
How about negative coping skills?
Gary, that's something we talked about before. I believe everyone has these moments of clarity. And I don't understand the mystery of why people don't always accept that reality and do something about it instead of doubling down on their denial. But I would say when you have a moment of clarity, document it. And then try to take some steps in a direction, whether you tell anybody about it or not, make a commitment to yourself to do that, because listen, nothing changes if nothing changes. You have to identify what's happening and listen. Self-destructive behavior is always the result of denial, and harming yourself is further an evidence that you don't like yourself. And that's the only way it makes sense. I would never harm my kids on purpose because I value them too much. But I didn't have that same value for me. And that was one of the things that really clicked in me, was when I had kids and I realized how much I cared for them, which then made me think, well, I seem to care more about them than I do me, because I did. But that value was a revelation to me, like, oh, because I never experienced it. Amber Lyn never experienced it. We never had parents. My mom was dead early and my dad was crazy. So I didn't understand that. But having those kids, like, click. And so that's what I mean by the layers, Gary. There's many things that led to those revelations. But the fulcrum is, do I act on the information I get, or do I go back in denial and avoid the consequences of the difficulty of making a change? And this is why I think safety and support can move the needle for people making those changes. If you're abjectly alone and or you feel that way, that makes the hurdle that much higher.
That's so good. Amber Lyn, the easy addictions for me, for any of us to pick out, are alcohol, gambling. But there's some subtle ones. Amazon, to me, is one. And
I was going to say, my new hobby right now is add to cart.
right. And the more I mention that, a lot of men are saying, oh, yeah, I love Amazon. It's not just women with Amazon. And my first addiction was workaholism. And that one is celebrated in America. Oh, look at that guy. He's going places. Or look at her. She's climbing the ladder. And it's really celebrated. And what I now see, Patrick and Amber Lyn, and maybe y'all can share on this, it's not really a question, it's really just kind of open discussion, is when I find myself, I think of it like gauges on my car. But when I find myself working too much or shopping too much, exercise, anything in excess, I'm like, what's wrong with you, Gary? Because now I look at that as almost a symptom, because there's a great line in one of the 12-step books. It says that it could be drinking or eating or gambling or whatever. I don't really mention 12 steps too much, but it says drinking is merely a symptom.
Exactly true.
And I think shopping, overeating, gambling, porn, what are your thoughts on just the topic of conversation? It's not really a question.
100%. It's a symptom. I believe the core of addiction is a lack of peace. I always ask myself, what's eating my peace? What's disturbing my peace? What's bothering me? And instead of answering that question, I want to distract with fill in the blank. And I did it for years with religion and climbing the ladder there, similar to climbing the ladder in a business, and more ministry. And, at one point I was on the radio and TV, and I had a small movie production company, and I had a full-blown business and 2 kids.
It's still workaholism. Doesn't matter what it's under.
Exactly. But I had to spiritualize because, I was doing it for the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
And those are the worst kind. But my point is like, once I started to understand what was eroding my peace and destroying it, that's when, so I see this all the time with people that I work with. Once the peace goes up, the desire to distract goes down, and they're equally connected. Higher the peace, the lower the distraction needed. The lower the peace, the higher the distraction needed. And, you look at our culture, and we have a problem with peace, and subsequently we have a lot of distractions. And I would say the number one consequence of that is healthy relationships. They take the brunt of those consequences.
It seems a little bit like whack-a-mole. Amber Lyn gets out of the destructive relationship, and then she gets out into the world, and then, oh my God, I got to be careful for all these other things out there. You said it best, if you're comfortable in your own skin and you feel worthy, all that other stuff is just noise. And the one constant that I have found is spirituality and God. I name it God. But I don't care what that is to other people. The God on the inside. I don't have to earn that. And so, Amber Lyn, seeing someone get out of the relationship that you got in, and Patrick, seeing somebody get out of what you got out of, who I chose to be the hero in my book was Harriet Tubman. And she goes back and continues to help people. And that's what I see in y'all. Y'all are staying free because you're reaching back. You're giving a hand up. If you want to help yourself, I'm here for you. I am so grateful to have y'all on the show today. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add?
Just really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm really grateful that you're doing this and that you're continuing to, in your way, reach back to help others with the experience that you had. And, I see it as very powerful, and I'm hoping for lots of success, and we can move the needle on people living healthier and happier, more productive, in a healthy way lives with great peace.
Well, how can we help your cause? I mean, is there anything we can plug?
Well, not yet. I have a book that's probably going to be coming out in the spring that's specific to emotional abuse. I have a YouTube channel, Patrick Doyle. If people want to get some free resources and get some information about this stuff, they certainly can go to patrickdoyle.life. And if they are in a difficult relationship, they can sign up to Pathway to Hope and get some real help. And I did a whole video series, in-depth, nuanced, to try to help them get clarity. Then there's also the community, which Amber is the leader of. So it's they can go there if they want resources.
Yeah, Patrick and I also do one-on-one coaching. So if that's something you're looking for and the thing we said resonated, and you're like, this girl gets me or he gets me, like, feel free to reach out through patrickdoyle.life. Get a hold of me through that too.
Patrick, thanks so much, man, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
And Amber Lyn, it was great having you on here as well, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Gary. You too.
And that wraps up another episode of Success Paradox. If you like the show, take a moment to subscribe so we'll get you notified when the new episode drops. Also, if you have a moment, I'd love it if you left us a review so that other incredible individuals like yourself can learn about the show. I'll see you next time.
To learn and practice the Success Paradox lifestyle, visit GaryCCooper.com. The Success Paradox is a production of Forbes Books.